Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Hopefully, we've already connected. I know many of you, but in case we haven't, I'm Nicole Klein. I work with the Policy Circle. One of the things that I work and direct on are our state leadership councils. So thank you all for our state leadership council members who could be here today. Just a couple of things before I turn this conversation over to Sylvie. I want to go over a few things just to make your experience a little more smooth, especially if you're new to Zoom. So we are recording this conversation. We do have some council members who aren't able to attend. So we want to make sure that this program is available to people who want to participate and see it. Please do turn off your notifications by accessing your network preferences and settings on your computer and your phone. You're all should be currently muted. We will do a quick round of introductions at the beginning before we introduce our special guest today. And I'll unmute each of you as Sylvie invites you to give that quick introduction. If you'd like to participate in the Q&A today, you'll notify me by clicking on the raise hand button. You can also use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you are on by phone, you can push *9 to activate the raise hand feature and I will call on you. So I'd now like to turn it over to Sylvie Legere, who's one of our co-founders and the president of the Policy Circle.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone, for joining. And thank you, Nicole and Molly, for setting this up. And thank you, James, for joining us today at lunch. So I want to welcome everyone to our first State Leadership Council virtual program. So this is, so it's great to see everyone. And we have council members from Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And our goal here is really to create unique programming opportunities to equip council members with new tools to enhance your leadership capabilities, and then to meet each other. So this is a really exclusive programming, and our first one. I'm really honored for James to be able to participate. And before I introduce James, I would like everyone to give everyone the opportunity to make a quick 30-second introduction so we can begin to learn about each other. And so I'd like to, I'll call upon everyone to share your name, your state, your role on the State Leadership Council, and your current focus, either personally, professionally, in your community. So I'd like to start with Amanda Muldoon.
Hi.
Amanda, you're on.
How are you doing? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, good. I'm sorry that you can't see me. I'm on my work laptop, and my my video is taken up by Skype, so it doesn't work on Zoom. So I apologize for that. But I think I've met just about all of you. Sarah-Lene just jumped on, so I don't know if I've ever met her. But I'm in Muldoon. I live in Fort Wayne, Indiana, so I co-lead the Fort Wayne Policy Circle with Lindsay, Hannah, and Jamie Locke. I'm sure some of you know them as well. Just been on the State Leadership Council. I think it's been since 2018 that I was invited to join, and worked on the expansion committee. Here in Fort Wayne, gosh, I'm involved in quite a few different things. Most notably, I think I'm involved with a program between a women's group called VOW and our local television station, Wayne TV, doing this House Divided project where a group of women get together to discuss current events, political events. We're all, there's some of us that are Democrats, some Republicans, some independent, and just model civil conversations that way. And they have a feature on the news each month. So just a little.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. Just so you know, you sound, it's really muffled. So I don't know if it's just a room, but it's hard to understand. But thank you. Thank you, Amanda.
So I think I might jump off and go back on.
Okay. All right. Sandy Geringer. Sandy?
Hi, this is Sandy.
Oh, great.
It's Sandy Geringer. I'm from Policy Circle, River North, Illinois. And as far as Policy Circle, I'm working on expansion, working with other groups to get other Policy Circle people involved and in the Chicago area.
Great. Morgan Perrell from Indiana. Is Morgan on?
Yep.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Morgan Perrell, and I'm with the Indiana State Leadership Council. I serve on the engagement committee, chair that. I also work for a public policy firm or public affairs firm here in the state, and work on education issues. I filed to run for school board today, so that's exciting news. So
Very
how that goes.
exciting. Congratulations. Congratulations.
We'll see.
Great. Vasavi Shaka.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vasavi Chaka. I'm from Naperville. We have a policy circle called Community Conversations. Darlene is part of that, and we are actually going through the briefs on election 2020. We just finished one brief last week on election integrity, and we are going to do the sequence of discussions on the election circle this year. So I also serve on the engagement committee with Darlene, and it's been a great honor to be on policy circle, and then I'm learning a lot, and also having a lot of ideas how to engage in the civic engagement, and I'm actually sharing these ideas within the Indian American community as well. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you, Vasavi. And you're very involved in combating human trafficking as well.
Yes.
One of your issues. Darlene Singer.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Darlene Singer from Illinois. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. From Illinois, I work with engagement on the leadership. Very glad to do that. I'm a former state representative for the state of Illinois out of Naperville, and did a lot of things politically in my career. I ran for Congress, ran statewide as for comptroller, and actually worked for Governor Bruce Browner for a period of time. So love the work that Policy Circle does. Love the fact that women are discussing policy, which is so important, and glad to be part of this call.
Great. Nancy, thank you. Nancy Mathewson.
Hi, I'm Nancy Matheson. I'm a co-chair of the Illinois State Leadership Council. And I also run a circle in Lake Forest, Illinois. I'm chair of the expansion committee on the Leadership Council. And one target audience we're really excited about reaching out to are immigrant women in the Chicagoland area. And we had some great news this week because a new circle is forming. The circle leader is my friend, Ilana Gordon, who's from Ukraine. She's been in this country about 20 years, and she's starting a circle called the Russian Bear. It's very exciting. And it will include her friends on the Chicago Northwest side who are basically Russian and Ukrainian origin. And we're thrilled about that because I think these women have a tremendous story to tell as they left a country, in a nation like that to come to the United States and, share their impressions of what's going on here in the United States. So Ilana's having her first meeting tomorrow night in a restaurant in Buffalo Grove. I'm going to join her, and we're just tremendously excited about the direction this is going.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I think Joan Lassan will also be joining.
Good.
So yeah.
Very exciting.
Excellent. Claire Morrison.
Not seeing Claire.
Okay. Katie Glick. Katie, thanks for joining.
Hi, Katie Glick. I co-chair the Indiana State Leadership Council, and glad to see my fellow Hoosiers on the call today. I've been involved in the policy circle from the beginning, first conversations here in Indiana. So it's very exciting to see kind of the change and the growth and development of the policy circle. Very excited about that. I do business development at a law firm based in Indianapolis, Ice Miller. I live on our family farm here in Columbus, Indiana, with my husband and 2 daughters. So,
great. And finally, Beth Feely. I think we're missing 2 people. Oh, Beth, you're muted. Great.
There we go. Hi, everybody. I am Beth Feely. I too have been involved with Policy Circle since the beginning. And actually it's precursor, the Rose Friedman Society, which I co-led with Sylvie. And I also used to work for Policy Circle, writing the policy briefs. And I too am on the State Leadership Council for Illinois, co-chairing that with Nancy and Lisa. heading up the engagement arm, so working closely with Darlene and Vasavi. And we look forward to having information out to you all soon, at least those Illinoisans, on how to get more engaged. And then outside of this, I work as an advisor to the Woodson Center, specifically helping launch its 1776 effort, which we did in February, which is a Black-led group of scholars and activists that are speaking out in defense of American values. And I also am a mom. I have 3 kids and a husband, and we live, as I said, north of Chicago here. So great to be on the call. Really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And I think we're missing Jillian Burness and Julie Grace, who will be joining us hopefully later. So with that, I'd like to introduce James Lindsay. I'm really thrilled to introduce him to all of you because he's the founder of New Discourses, and he has a consulting firm to corporations around how to engage in the current, in really challenging topics that our society is faced with today. And he's the author, he's an author with a PhD in mathematics. He's written 6 books. The forthcoming book called Cynical Theories with Helen Plekrose, and his essays have appeared in publications including the New York Times, the LA Times, USA Today, Time Magazine, Scientific American, among others. He was one of the participants in the Grievance Studies Affairs that exposes that's an expose of a stunning political corruption deep within our universities and scholarships. He lives in Knoxville, Tennessee. And so welcome, James, and thank you for taking the time. I know you're extremely busy. So really great to be able to have this conversation with you and engage with our State Leadership Council. The topic for today is actually the title of your book that was published this last October. And I think I found your book, I think it was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal. The title is How to Have Impossible Conversations. It's a very practical guide, and Policy Circle women, our leaders on this program, are interested in really fine-tuning their facilitation skills, and especially when we're faced with difficult and complex conversations in the Policy Circle, but mostly in the community and also in our work. So what I'd like to do is take a few minutes to discuss with James, and then I'll open it up to everyone to ask different questions. You know, I'd like to start with, so your book, you guys, the book really presents ingredients of a good conversations and levels of conversation skills to develop. It would be great for you to unpack for us kind of your thinking in terms of levels of conversation skills and how you intended the book to be used. Because perhaps you haven't read it, but it starts with a level 1, intermediate level, advanced level, and then if you're really dealing with ideologue, extremely advanced techniques. So please share with us why you think in terms of levels of conversations.
Well, the idea to think in terms of levels kind of came from 2 sources. One is that there's always, you know, the basics of everything, and you want to build upward from the basics to master any skill. So you do want to have the very basics of conversation, like listening and an orientation toward learning and trying to understand the person you're speaking with, building rapport like we just did, where everybody introduced themselves. So we feel like we have a small bit of connection with one another before we launch into anything. But also, we wanted to, when we were doing the research for this, so the book's genesis came from my co-author being a educational philosopher, and his background is mainly in the Socratic method and using it in application, both in educational settings and kind of out in the world. He actually worked with prison inmates and developed means of talking them out of the values that led them to be criminals as an experiment in the state of Oregon, and was very successful in getting recidivism very low with that method. And so we wanted to take that expertise and expand upon that approach to bring it into the general realm of trying to talk to anybody about anything. And we started reading negotiations literature and noticed that the Harvard Negotiation Project in particular had said that there are always 3 conversations happening at once anytime you have a conversation, especially one that gets difficult or contentious. They said there's the level at which conversations, there's discussing what's happening, the factual matters or the topic of interest. And then beneath that, there's an emotional layer where people's emotions are getting impacted and coming into the picture. And then beneath that, even more deep, there's a matter of when somebody's identity is on the line with in terms of how the conversation is going. So how they view themselves, whether that's as an individual. We often think in terms of things like woman or racial categories now, but you could think of yourself as a leader, as a parent, as a mother. There's lots of different, as a Republican or a Democrat, a conservative, a liberal, a progressive. There are lots of identity factors that people try to live up to and what it means to be a good and valuable member of some community. And what they said was that if you look at those three levels, the deeper you get, the harder it gets to have a conversation if any disagreement arises. And so the book is sort of organized in a fashion where it's all very much the basics, where anybody can stay within that what's happening, what's going on, what are the facts level very easily. And then it starts while setting it up to say, oh, well, if you find yourself in a situation where you have to deal with emotions or you have to do counterintuitive thinking, like thinking in terms of how something might be wrong rather than how something might be right, which is counterintuitive. So if you have to set aside those natural impulses or deal with emotions, then you need more advanced techniques that are, because they're harder for people to do. They aren't natural and intuitive. And then if you're starting to deal with conversations that get into deep identity-based issues, the paradigm changes almost completely. So you need very advanced techniques that we drew pretty heavily, from a variety of literature, moral philosophy, and moral psychology in particular, but also hostage negotiations and cult exiting and, some really deep stuff, the psychological, the therapy literature, talk therapy literature to deal with how you deal with an identity clash in conversation. So we had to think in terms of levels from very basic things that make all conversations work and then get into the nuts and bolts of what makes them go wrong and what goes against our intuitions. So we set it up in terms of those levels.
So that's really helpful, and then it's really helpful to think of it in terms of three levels of conversation, because then you can really ask yourself, well, what level am I in when dealing with someone? So give us, what are some of the key ingredients to like a constructive conversation? There's some that I noted, and one, I think there were two that I feel would be great for us to discuss a little bit more. One was having a goal for the conversation. And then in your book, you mentioned these rapport rules that come back a few times in your book. So it'd be great for you to unpack. And another thing that you mentioned, and I think would be relevant to this group, was don't talk about facts. And then the whole policy circle is like facts, not emotions. We're all about facts. So let's start with having a goal. Give us some examples and, what are the key components?
Sure. So when we talk about goals in conversation, of course, conversations are organic things that happen between people, but they're also things that we have as a deliberate, intentional project, like what we're doing now, where we're trying to cover certain material or we're trying to discuss for a particular purpose. And in both cases, you want to be able to be aware of your goal. When you have an intentional conversation, like a business meeting, it's good to set the tone. The goal of this conversation is to, this is our meeting agenda. This is what we want to cover. These are the things we want to get out of it. If you're having a more organic conversation with a friend or a colleague or something that's outside of a very specific context, you also want to be able to identify what are the goals here. Is my goal to change this person's mind about something? Is it my goal to persuade? Is my goal to maintain the relationship and deepen that relationship? So you want to kind of be aware of what you're doing. So this is in the kind of leadership literature they call bringing intentionality into the conversation. Kind of know where you're going, know what you want to get out of it. And if you need to, obviously when you're talking with your friends, you wouldn't need to make explicit what the purpose of the conversation is. But if you can keep that in mind, it's easy to avoid falling into the pitfalls that throw conversations off. So if you know, for example, that you're talking about a delicate issue with a friend, and you know that the goal is to preserve the friendship and create a space of healing, then those moments where defensiveness comes up, you know that it's less important to push and more your point, for example, and more important to value the relationship and just let the difference not drive you apart. So you want to be aware of what the goal is. Now, when the goal is something very intentional, maybe business oriented, of course, we say avoid facts, but you can't avoid facts in a practical conversation or in what we would describe in the book as one that's engaged in the dialectical process of heading toward truth and working back and forth off of other people to get toward a more full understanding. But when disagreements arise, facts almost never resolve disagreements. And that's very important to realize. Most people are not very good at deciding to defer to the facts once emotions or once some other factor comes into it. So if we were talking, for example, about 2 + 2 = 4, and you say, no, it's 5, then maybe we could pull some, little stones out and put 2 of them here and 2 of them there and put them in. We could resort to facts to get that. But whenever there's some emotional issue, so this levels of conversation becomes relevant again, facts will not convince an emotion. As you know, the famous saying now from not that I'm a huge fan, but of Ben Shapiro is facts don't care about your feelings. And of course the opposite is true too. Feelings don't care much about your facts. People want to have that emotion result. So what we found is that in conversations where there's a substantive disagreement, you have to settle the actual nature of the human disagreement before anybody can bring facts to the table to try to understand. So when the conversation becomes impossible or difficult, that's when you need to avoid facts to try to get out of that tension, unless you can set that intentional goal. Look, we're going to set aside our personal issues today, and all we're going to do is look at the facts and adhere to the facts. So I don't want to give a misimpression with that avoid facts, but I do want to say that if you do have to set that as a goal, that you then kind of police for a group, or else it's very easy for facts to become, a shouting match. Well, I have these facts and you have those facts. And you can look at controversial issues like climate change, and everybody believes they have this fact or that fact, and nobody can agree. The fact doesn't settle the argument because there's something deeper and more human that's going on that has to be resolved first.
And also I find we facilitated a workshop around facilitating complex discussions. And one of the key things is also to just ask, when dealing with a big issue, it's like, well, what is the goal? What are we trying to accomplish with this new policy, like defunding the police, or, or even within a school context, specific things. What are we trying to accomplish so that we have a discussion first around the goals, and the short term, long term, you're able to discuss that and agree on a goal, and agree on perhaps the facts that you are using to support that goal. So that was kind of one of the pieces. Tell us a little bit about applying this rapport, what's rapport, and and then these rules, because I thought they're really interesting. One is really listening and restate, list the points of agreement, mention anything you learned, and then you can have a rebuttal or a criticism. Tell us a little bit about that.
So Rappaport is a person. It's Anatoly Rappaport, who was a game theorist, a mathematician. But this was his rules of engagement when there would be disagreement. And it was a very effective set of rules. He's very famous. Rappaport is most famous for having developed the concept of tit for tat. So if you and I are in a cooperative environment, I don't know how much game theory we have to get into. I am a mathematician, but it gets dry. But if you and I are in a disagreement or a conversation of some sort, and we're collaborating, as long as you're collaborating with me, I continue to collaborate with you, and we have a positive sum situation where we're both being positive. But if you suddenly defect and say insult me or shoot me down, then tit for tat is a strategy that actually maximizes the outcomes. And so you defect from me, I defect from you back. Hopefully you learn your lesson, and then we go back to cooperating together. And if you defect from me again, I defect from you again, until we get back on a cooperative track. And this is a game theoretic solution to what's called the iterated prisoner's dilemma, but we don't really have to get into the ugly details of all of the game theory. So this is what Rappaport was famous for. And so you could see Rappaport's rules as a strategy for him to put forth that best show, no matter what the other person comes to you with, that best show of cooperation. And so his case was that you should make sure, I mean, to summarize, of course, you listed that it's in 4 points, the way that he phrased it. But to summarize, the point is that you want to make sure that the person you're speaking with understood, or so they know that you understood them. So if you've said something to me, I want to be able to say it back to you in a way where it's so clear, and that you realize I understood you so clearly that you think, wow, I wish I would have said it that way in the first place. So clearly that means the point of communication has been achieved. The point of communication, of course, is to create a shared intention that we're both thinking the same thing, with words being the mediator that gets us from one place to the other. And so I want to show the person who's talking to me, or that I'm interested in dialoguing with, that I fully understood their position, and make it clear to them by saying it back to them, and even stating if there's any places where I didn't know this and I learned this from you, this is what I picked up from you. And at that point, what you end up doing is showing that you've taken that person seriously. You've shown that you've actually taken the time to understand their position before you disagree with it, if that's where it's going to go, or before you try to take it in some further direction, if that's what you want to do with it. And then you can add, you know, your disagreement. You say, okay, so I fully understood this, and I'm afraid that you haven't taken into account this particular detail, whatever the issue is. And then that's a kind of criticism. People don't tend to take criticism very well, and often tend to feel like they weren't understood. And so Rappaport's rules are a habit of showing you actually fully understood, proving to the person, convincing them first that you heard them and you understood them, before you try to change what they said, whether with an argument against it, or a rebuttal, or a challenge, or even a modification.
Right. Well, I thought that was a really a great insight. So in the interest of time, I have other questions, you know, about specific techniques around group setting. Our listeners are, you know, likely to be engaged in heated community discussions, especially now around school reopenings, around racial tensions, and even in policy circles. And a lot of times we find ourselves with conversations being hijacked, where the agenda is a little bit hijacked. I was in a board meeting and I was not prepared to engage on something. So I'd love to turn it over to some of our participants. Maybe you have some questions. You know, does anyone have a question want to ask? Beth, no, you have a question. Oh, unmute.
There we go. All right, Beth, go
And
ahead.
click on raise a hand if you have so I could see you, or wave or something like that. Okay.
Okay.
Wave if you have a question, or click raise hand, or use the chat.
Super. So thank you, first of all, because I've been following your story since the hoax papers were published, and so appreciate all the work that you've been doing. And I think the Rappaport rule is really interesting. So I have a couple questions. One, is that ever manipulated for bad purposes? And what do you do about that? And then my second question is, you had talked a little bit about if you can't agree upon the facts, then it's going to be hard to kind of go further in a conversation. What do you do if it seems as though the other side doesn't care about facts, that they are much more into the feelings, and how do you address that?
Yeah, those are actually super difficult issues. Everything, I think, has a light side and a dark side. So certainly the Rappaport's rules could be hijacked, and in particular, or to use for nefarious purposes, in particular, kind of forcing you to indicate that you understood, and then constantly indicating that, no, you didn't understand me, so you need to go further. You didn't understand me, you need to do better. And you all will often hear that exact phrase, do better, in that context. And so it is very difficult at that point. And you do sometimes have to almost flip the situation around. And I think this applies to both of the questions you were asking. And at some point you do have to ask, and this kind of gets into, in the book, we talk about the concept of defeasibility of a claim. If somebody says, oh, something's true, and you can't really make headway on it, you can ask very specifically, what would it take to convince you that I've understood? Because now I want to meet that bar. And if the answer is nothing, then the person that you're talking to has sort of exposed that they're not coming from a place where they want to have reasonable consensus. And at that point, you know, I wish there was a magic wand where you could just magically make the conversation go on track from there, but often you cannot. And you have to be content to say, well, then this can't be a productive conversation, and maybe we can circle back to it at the time when we can have a more productive dialogue about it. So if somebody's kind of presenting you with something that seems to be unsatisfiable, you can actually pause. You can name the dynamic in general. This is very valuable when other like feelings or whatever else come into the matter, and you can name the dynamic, and you can say, it seems like that it's very difficult to I can't identify. So you always want to try to put it on yourself. I can't identify the thing that would satisfy what you're looking for. Could you tell me something that would be adequate in the situation, and let's see if we can work to it. And if all they offer is, you know, more vagueness or more requests to get to their feelings, hopefully you've set some kind of an intentional meeting agenda, and can have some kind of a moderator point out this isn't the time for this. And, you know, in a professional setting, usually that would be set aside from the meeting, and people have to go to mediators later and work out their differences, because it does hijack and take away from meetings. The bad side of impossible conversations being in the title is that people mistakenly believe that, you know, we can give them tools that will fix any conversation. But it's a little bit of a language game, I guess. We didn't mean it to be, but if somebody's actually got to be having a conversation with you rather than cynically reading into your motives or just being unwilling to move anywhere, and at which point in the book we repeatedly say, well, at some point you have to walk away. You have to just name the dynamic, hope it resolves the problem, and walk away. Often just by saying, I feel like this is turning into a very emotional conversation. This is it feels like it's getting off track. What would it take to get it back on track? And see what they say. And if the answer turns out to be nothing or something, you know, wildly unreasonable, you hope that the other people looking on can see that that's the case. I understand in our present moment that that's a frustrating answer, because it doesn't always work, and it doesn't always work out well. There's no magic wand here.
Yeah, your book
Just
does
a quick
say, you know,
follow-up.
sometimes to walk away. So you do say that. Sometimes you have to walk away, or say, table the conversation for another time with more facts. Morgan, you have a question.
Okay.
Oh, there you go.
And maybe this will be kind of the same answer. But I appreciate the Rappaport rules. I feel like I know where maybe I went wrong earlier this week. But what happens, or how would you handle somebody who maybe kind of talks over you, kind of maybe puts words in your mouth sometimes and speaks over you in a group setting, puts words in your mouth too and kind of speaks over you when you're trying to talk?
Right. So I will tell you, by the way, Rappaport's rules was many people emailed me when the coronavirus lockdowns first started and said, you know, our marriage was falling apart, and we started using Rappaport's rules, and we could actually have conversation. You know, our couple has never spent this much time together, and now we can talk to each other again by having to do this. So it does actually help when you have people, you know, that are getting a bit contentious. And this kind of a situation where people are talking over you, again, it's very difficult. Group settings are a much different circumstance than a one-on-one setting, because there's always an element that everybody knows that they're not just speaking with the person they're speaking with, they're also speaking to the audience, and they're trying to make a show of that, or they're trying to be very deliberate about giving their message or discrediting the person who disagrees with them. And you can request that the person live up to Rappaport's rules. You don't have to use that phrasing, but you can request. It's very easy. Again, you can name the dynamic and say, I don't feel as though that's an accurate representation of my view. Would you mind summarizing my view back to me so I can help you get to the same level of understanding of what I'm talking about as I have? And then we can proceed, because what you do really want to try to foster at all times, and we make a point of this throughout the book, is that the people conversing are partnerships in a project. And that project of conversation is to create shared understanding and shared intention, hopefully for a productive purpose. And so naming that dynamic and then asking to be brought back to that, look, we're having a misunderstanding. I feel like I'm not being properly represented. Could you summarize what you believe my position is so that we can now enter into a productive dialogue about our disagreement itself? So you kind of jump levels and say, let's not talk about the issue anymore. Let's talk about our specific disagreement, and ask them to articulate it for you. And often what happens is they end up not able to articulate your point correctly. And many times they realize that in real time if they're not caught up in some emotional or identity-based, kind of separation from conversation in a productive fashion. And they will catch themselves and open themselves up to hearing better. Okay, maybe I didn't understand you as well. It depends though. You do have to have a mindset for everybody that the point of the thing is supposed to, be a productive dialogue. A trick you can use from later on in the book, and this is almost like dark arts. So I know that people get a little upset about this one. It is dark arts. It came out of sales. So it's called altar casting. Altar casting is actually very valuable in group settings where we did our little introduction at the beginning and you have the introduction. Altar casting is casting people that you're speaking with into a role that you want to create a social pressure that they have to conform to. So in the case of a group Zoom meeting like this, you guys are all, we know that you came because we're all very interested in getting to the bottom of this particular question. I know that everybody's here is ready to talk about it in the most level-headed and civil way to try to leave things out. You just, state that this is the social pressure that exists in this conversation. And like, it is dark art, so it definitely gets used back against people. But if you set up this tone of, we're here to have a civil conversation, we're here to understand each other, we're all people who want to understand one another, people will actually conform to that social role that you've cast them into. So if you have a meeting you suspect might be contentious, you can actually cast the meeting from the beginning and put everybody into an identity feeling of we're here to try to understand one another. And then when you start to make that appeal, like I don't feel understood, that identity pressure of we're here to understand one another weighs on them pretty heavily, and the group will actually help reinforce that for you. Okay. So it is a little dark arts, and remember that could easily be used, and it is being used in many conversations. It does get used it's hijacked to cast people into roles of guilt or shame so that they have to listen. Best to do it proactively. Leadership would be doing it proactively in a way to facilitate positivity and productivity, rather than doing it in a negative way to get people to listen to you or believe what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right. I see that. Thank you. I'm glad you brought up altar casting, because that is a interesting part of the book. I know that Beth has a question. Before I go to Beth, anyone else has a question? Darlene, Vasavi, do you guys, Nancy? No? Okay, Beth.
I wanted to piggyback off that statement of identity and just ask your opinion. Earlier you said kind of the more that that you get into kind of discussions that have to do with identity, that requires higher level types of discussion. Do you think that because today identity is such a huge topic and it's so encouraged for people to explore that is partially explains kind of why things are so polarized and kind of high octane?
Yep, it's in fact, I think the exact opposite thing that everybody should be doing if they want to have productive meetings, productive dialogue, get to solutions to problems. If you look I don't want to get this weird long view, but if you look at the philosophical tradition and leading into the scientific tradition, you can characterize that as, and it applies in business too, but is to set the person aside as much as possible to focus on, if it's philosophy, it's the truth. If it's science, it's, whatever the results are, which we could also say is the truth. If it's business, it's whatever the business objective at hand is. If it's law, it's what does the actual law say and what is the proper interpretation of it in this case. And so you're constantly trying to slice away from the person, so that we're now caught in a weird societal dynamic where everyone's identity is being forwarded as the most important thing, when you look at that from a perspective, and again, Harvard Negotiation Project published this book, Difficult Conversations, I don't know, almost 2 decades ago, is very clear about it. When you look at it from that perspective, identity issues are virtually impossible conversations. People will dig in very deeply with their identity, and because they feel like something very personal is at stake if they change their minds. We've all probably heard of the famous backfire effect, where you try to use facts or conversation or persuasion to change somebody's mind, and you end up making them deeper in their own pre-existing belief. You make it worse, not better, rather than changing their minds. So it's very commonly explored with the vaccine issue. And what researchers looking into the backfire effect found was that when people had some kind of an identity level challenge, that they had to overturn some aspect of their identity, usually in moral terms, they tend to backfire and dig into their belief to resolve the discomfort. So a specific example, if we used vaccines, would be to say that and I don't mean to dive into something terribly controversial, but it just highlights the issue. The reason that people have the stances that they have very strongly on vaccines typically is because they want to be the best parent they can possibly be. And so if they say are on the wrong side of that issue, and notice I very skillfully didn't say which side of the issue is right or wrong, but if they're on the wrong side of that issue, changing their mind requires them to admit to themselves that they've been doing something deeply harmful to children. And so that's the hill you have to get people over to get them to change their mind, because their identity as a good parent or as a person who cares about the best for children has to be the thing they have to go through the fire of having been wrong on something morally consequential. And they tend not to like to do that. And it's actually easier to get angry and double down. So when you start bringing this up in other domains, whether it's racial identity, whether it's gender identity, sex identity, sexual identity, and, as Judith Butler, if we're going to name some theorists, phrase it, that exasperated, et cetera, of identity categories, those things become very difficult because you're now talking about who somebody feels like they are as a person. And if they've been wrong about this thing. So let's look at it from the perspective of race. If these people are coming and teaching that this is the way to racial reconciliation, racial harmony, a better, less racist future, that's all very morally positive. And again, it doesn't matter what everybody in the conversation thinks that that's what they're going for. And if you have two people who disagree, clearly one of them must be somewhat wrong. By what the mathematicians call the law of the excluded middle. And therefore, somebody has to give in and notice that maybe they've been contributing to or preventing progress on a very morally important situation. And that if that's tied even further to who you feel like you are as a person, not just the moral valence, it just gets that extra level of difficulty. What can be done about it? There are a few things. In the book, we talk about learning other people's moral languages. You have to understand the terminology that they're using from their perspective so that you can act as an interpreter between the two worlds, in a sense. You have to, if it's just like politics, you have to learn, if you're a liberal, to speak conservative, and then you can bridge the gap. And if you're conservative, you have to learn to speak liberal, and then you can talk to each other. Oh, what they really mean is this. And you get to that shared intention and that productive space. When it's something like racial identity, it gets much harder. So the other thing you can do besides learning the moral languages is, again, that same, I don't want to call it a trick, but it's almost a technique of naming the dynamic. And I think what we actually have to do is not within the individual space, but at the level of setting goals and intentions, and kind of as a societal ethic that we need to start working toward more broadly, is again that putting the person into the situation makes it more personal and more difficult to have productive conversations about, say, policy. It's very difficult to. So we want to remove that as much as possible while recognizing and hearing people's concerns. So there's this really delicate balance. I can't give you a magic one on this one. It's very difficult. I can tell you, for those who are interested, the current theories from my other research that you've been interested in make this problem worse, not better, as far as I can tell. And so we really want to try to find a new way to have this conversation going forward, but it's difficult.
I think we have a question from Amanda. Amanda, are you on?
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me better this time?
And Darlene, and then we'll wrap it up. Darlene, you had a question, right? So, and then we'll wrap it up. Go ahead.
Thank you. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think that words, of course, really have an impact, and word choice, of course, matters in conversations too. So just some tips on some words we might want to avoid and maybe some phrases or words to use instead.
Sure. It's actually very difficult. There's multiple things happening all at once here that have to be addressed. Of course, you want to avoid any, I mean, so just something we did not write in the book that I've learned about since is called, I don't know why it's called this, it's called Keith's Law. And normally you have these, you know, kind of quirky little laws like Sturgeon's Law, named after somebody whose last name was Sturgeon. And here you have Keith's Law, and it's named after somebody whose first name was Keith, and I don't know why. But anyway, Keith's Law is that the more political something is perceived to be, the less credible it is considered. And so you definitely want to avoid any kind of language that hints around that you have a particular political an investment in a particular political side when you're trying to have any conversation across a gap. You definitely want to try to avoid language that accelerates division. For example, if somebody brings up a racial category, you know, they say, for very specifically, they say, well, Black people have suffered blah, blah, blah throughout history. You do not ever want to say, well, white people have suffered blah, 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 you know, back throughout history, and turn it into a shouting match about who suffered more. In general, you want to avoid the word, this is very, very, very difficult, but you want to minimize your use of the word but, especially when somebody has said something to you and you disagree with it. You definitely do not want to say, yeah, but, because that now means that you didn't agree with anything they said. That's where the Rappaport's rules issue comes in. So you want to try to avoid politically charged language. We recently wrote a template where it comes to talking about the issues of, say, these anti-racism and diversity trainings in the workplace. My colleague Helen Pluckrose and I did, and publish it. And so you want to avoid phrases like social justice warrior, or something that shows, oh, you're the kind of person who uses that kind of terminology to describe this thing. You want to try to use as formal and clear terminology as possible. Now, the other side of this is that many of the words that we're encountering that are very sensitive have more than one meaning. And so there's also a necessity to get people to say very clearly what they mean. So if somebody were to bring up that they believe that something that happened in the organization is racist, for example, that's a very charged word. Keith's Law would already tell you, watch out for that. But it is also something that's important to talk about when it comes up. In that case, it's very important now that we say, well, what do you mean by that? What goes along with that? And Sylvia was saying some stuff that was very good about that direction early in the conversation. You want to make sure that everybody understands the terms in the same way and that we're talking about the same things. But definitely you want to avoid any kind of jargon or lingo that places you in a particular camp that people would disagree with. So if it's something about, especially something like the coronavirus issue with schools opening, if you go out there and signal that you're a conservative, or you go out there and signal that you're on the left, whichever side it is, the other side's just not listening to you. They just don't take you seriously anymore. And so you want to try to find kind of neutral, common ground language. Like if you were going to have a debate with somebody in an academic setting, you don't go to their show and they don't come to your show. You try to find a neutral venue with a neutral moderator in between. So you want to try to find as much neutrality in those conversations as you can. But anything in particular that seems to accuse somebody of having it wrong, or that denies what they've just said, or that indicates that you haven't listened, you also want to avoid that. Those things are just landmines that will derail the conversation.
All right, thank you. And then just so you know, guys, we created a cheat sheet that features some examples of what to say that are from James' book. So, there's a lot of examples there that I find particularly useful. Darlene, you have the last question.
It's a bit unfortunate that you all got the theoretician of the pair. Peter is the much more practical of the two of us. I'm the theory guy.
Okay. Darlene.
Yeah, so my question is just briefly, how would you deal a situation where you're in a group, you're trying to have, say, a problem-solving situation or something worked out, and there's someone in the group that maybe yourself and others don't trust? How do you have conversations when you feel you don't trust somebody?
I didn't
And
expect that.
what I mean by don't trust, that you think that they're going to go out and,
You know what they're going to say.
yeah, you know
They're
what
gonna-
they're
When
going to say.
people know what I mean, when people
The
imagine
troublemaker.
that they know
This
what they're
troublemaker.
So I think that the best thing to do, so when we're talking again, group dynamics are much different than individual one-on-one conversations, or even, you know, 1 and 2 or 3 people. You know, small groups of people are very different from larger groups of people. I think when you're trying to have a very intentional conversation, as you were describing, you have this, you know, problem-solving setting. You're probably in a group of maybe a dozen or more people. One of the best things to do is, and you're afraid that there's going to be a troublemaker, is to have a very clear agenda that's been stated in advance. Again, you want to have as many objective standards for the thing as you can have. And you want to have somebody through some process that the majority or almost everybody in the group, or ideally everybody in the group, would recognize as authoritative, set aside as the facilitator. So in this case, it's, you know, Sylvie's in charge. So if Sylvie says you're being a troublemaker, Darlene, she's going to mute your microphone. And if everybody kind of agrees that somebody's in charge because there's a purpose, and that person's role in the group is to, you know, facilitate the achievement of that purpose, you can minimize the troublemaker. You can't what do you do when you know that the troublemaker is going to be there? I mean, at this point, I'm getting very frustrated, and I've talked with a number of friends of mine who are business owners and business leaders, and I just keep telling them, fire them. I mean, that's almost to the point where I am. There's a example, for just to give a quick example, a friend of mine owns a small PR company, something like 15 employees, so nothing huge. And she had this employee a couple of years ago who was that person that you knew was going to bring up whatever divisive thing. And she eventually did have to let that person go to solve the problem. There was no getting around that. The person just kept agitating. And so I would say that in the group setting, you want to have some sort of an authority that's been maybe democratically or by some process that everybody can recognize, established to keep the thing on track. And then you actually will have to intervene with the person individually, and it will have to be something, you know, where it's a person of authority or whatever that can go and intervene individually and say, you know, this is kind of a repeated problem. People are starting to get concerned with it. And there is an element to this where everybody's an individual, but you're also necessarily a team player here. And if that doesn't solve the problem, that's where my friend that owns the PR business had to let this woman go. And of course she raised a stink. So that's just going to happen. But it is a unfortunate problem that there are people who tend to be reliably, you know, untrustworthy troublemakers. The best solutions are, again, the cheap way to say it was good leadership. You know, have some mechanism by which leadership can be identified. The point of the leader is, and make sure it's, you know, stated clearly, is to facilitate the productive meeting agenda and to exclude from the meeting agenda that which is off of that goal. So we started talking about goals. The way to do it is to empower somebody, and it can be a rotating somebody or whatever's fair, to keep the meeting on target and to play police officer to throw out that which isn't productive to the meeting, or even table the discussion, or table the rest of the meeting, whatever it has to be. There are no good solutions to bad actors, as it turns out. There's only, you know, how do you manage the problem?
Great. Well, thank you so much, James, for your time. And I think this was, I hope everyone really got a lot out of this conversation. I certainly did. And I read your book, and it really enhances my understanding of it. So everyone will get a copy of James' book, and Peter Boghossian, his co-author. Here's the book. I'll just show you guys what it looks like. This is the book, and as well as a handout. I think my team will be distributing a PDF of a handout where we created a cheat sheet. This is the first pass. Would love your feedback, as I will be sharing it with James also, and to share kind of the greater to the Policy Circle community. community at large, and also on LinkedIn, because I feel it's a great tool. So thank you again, James. And it's been great to get to know you. And also I really look forward to more collaboration in the future. So thank you. I'd like to remind everyone that we have some upcoming programs. July 29th, next week, we have documentary filmmaker Chris Rufo, who will join us for a discussion about the latest film, America Lost. I don't know, James, if you know Chris.
I actually have a meeting with him on Friday that we're both giving a talk together. So I've
Well,
just
there
met
you
him.
go.
Yeah.
So members, what's unique about this, you have to watch the movie, because participants will be in breakout rooms for short discussions about the film, very much in a policy circle format. And then Chris will pop into each of the breakout rooms. This will be a new experience for us, and we're hoping that this will really enhance the level of engagement of our future programming. So please join us. As well as September 30th, we will have another State Leadership Council program. We're setting the bar pretty high here with having you on this one. So we'll have to come up with another good topic. So again, thank you so much. Thank you guys for being part of the Policy Circle, championing it, using it, and enhancing your leadership abilities in your community and your company. So thank you, and thank you so much, James. We've posted in the chat here. You can follow James on Twitter at New Discourses. Also his website, newdiscourses.com. And James also offers to come to companies to really help them navigate what is the messaging around the really controversial and difficult topics that we're all faced with today. So I encourage you to reach out directly to James. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, James. Have a great afternoon, everyone.